Right bracket chapter 13. Orchids or onions. If an angel should come here and speak his feelings as plainly as I do, I think he would say, "Oh, Latter-day Saints, why don't you open your eyes and behold the great work resting upon you, and that you have entered into? You are blind, you are stupid, you are in the dark, in the mist and fog, wandering to and fro like the boat upon the water without sail, rudder or oar, and you know not whither you are going. But we run first this way, and then that way, turning here and turning there, strewing our ways to strangers and doing that which we should not do." Brigham Young's Last Discourse to the Saints, August 1877, JD 19:94. After the death of Brigham Young, the church gradually moved into a new era. The Mormons were making that transition from spirituality to prosperity. But with their temporal increases, there also came threats by the government to take these increases away. The government of the United States had already taken many liberties to abandon the Constitution, or else violate it. In the rash and biased efforts to persecute and prosecute the Mormon people, they assumed the right to confiscate all church property, followed by the threat to confiscate all personal property. A Mormon couldn't even vote. In the midst of this Holocaust, members of the church were faced with the sacrifice of Abraham, and for many it meant concession and compromise, until they could live more peaceably and unitedly with those not of their faith. Doctrines which once made the saints right bracket a peculiar people were lost to the past. Now they wanted revelations that would bring them more unity with the world, rather than a segregation away from it. However, every revelation after 1889 was not a new revelation, but rather the abandonment of previous revelations. Modern Israel was following the traits of ancient Israel, and they sought for a Gentile king to rule over them. See I Samuel 8. An historian by the name of Eugene R. Campbell recently declared that Utah is rapidly succumbing to the wave of uniformity that has been growing in the nation. Our system of transportation, communication, our nationwide TV, radio, chain stores, packaged food, theater chains, clothing styles, are rapidly ending a uniqueness. We are no longer a peculiar people. This was the place, Speeches of the Year, Extension Publications, July 23, 1959, page 9. It is little wonder that Brigham Young, the prophet and seer that he was, requested his coffin to be deep enough that he could turn over if he so desired. It was revealed to him that the time was coming when the saints would become popular with the world, for he had seen in sorrow, in a dream or in dreams, this people clothed in the fashions of Babylon, and drinking in the spirit of Babylon, until one could hardly tell a saint from a black leg. And he felt like shouting, "To your tents, O Israel!" because it was the only thing that could keep this people pure. Messiah Hancock JRNL. Page 47. Conformity to worldly standards and social acceptance soon became implanted into the minds of the Latter-day Saints. They clamored for and rejoiced in public recognition. By the time of Heber J. Grant, the modern Mormon was willing to abandon any law, principle or ordinance in their effort toward obeying, honoring and sustaining the law of the land, regardless of how unjust or ridiculous it may have been. It would have right bracket been more honorable to face any or all opposition, and boldly declare that they claim the privilege of worshipping Almighty God, according to the dictates of our own conscience, regardless of any worldly wealth or social favor. As outside pressures upon the church grew, so did the arguments, both pro and con, over the Negro issue. In 1924 Joseph F. Smith noted that the question arises from time to time in regard to the Negro race and the priesthood. It is true that the Negro race is barred from holding the priesthood, and this has always been the case. The prophet Joseph Smith taught this doctrine. Imp. Era 27:564. By 1931 Joseph Fielding Smith compiled a comprehensive work which clearly explained the reason for the Negro ban from the priesthood. His book was titled The Way to Perfection. He was becoming one of the foremost authoritarians of the church on doctrinal themes, and in his clear, forceful style, he made some very important considerations. Millions of souls have come into this world cursed with a black skin, and have been denied the privilege of priesthood and the fullness of the blessings of the gospel. These are the descendants of Cain. Moreover, they have been made to feel their inferiority, and have been separated from the rest of mankind from the beginning. Way to Perfection, page 101. The Canaanites before the flood preserved the curse in the land, the gospel was not taken to them, and no other people would associate with them. The Canaanites after the flood also preserved the curse in the land, and were denied the rights of priesthood. Way to Perfection, page 108. This doctrine did not originate with President Brigham Young, but was taught by the prophet Joseph Smith. At a meeting of the general authorities of the church, held August 22, 1895, the question of the status of the Negro in relation to the priesthood was asked, and the minutes of that meeting say, President George Buchanan remarked that the prophet taught this doctrine, that the seed of Cain could not receive the priesthood nor act in any of the offices of the priesthood until the seed of Abel should come forward and take precedence over Cain's offspring. Way to Perfection, page 110. But even Joseph Fielding Smith himself began to mellow and take a less forceful approach toward this doctrine. For example, in 1931 he wrote, Not only was Cain called upon to suffer, but because of his wickedness, he became the father of an inferior race. Way to Perfection, page 101. Then by 1962 he had reversed this former stand by stating, The Latter-day Saints, so commonly called Mormons, have no animosity towards the Negro. Neither have they described him as belonging to an inferior race. Day. News Church Section, June 14, 1962, page 3. Because he was one of the foremost and most outspoken authorities on the Negro issue, he was deluged with letters of protest. On one occasion, on February 14, 1963, he retorted, I am getting a little fed up on the idea that so many people think I am responsible for the Negro not holding the priesthood. The Mormon stand was beginning to be noted in the nation's newspapers, and the Negro issue became a political football. Joseph Fielding Smith stated, The ignorance on the part of writers who do not belong to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, in relation to the view of the _Mormons on the status religiously or otherwise of the Negro is inexcusable. There is no doubt that in the campaign of George Romney, enemies will play up the Negro question to the very limit. The pity of it all is that they start with a false premise, and therefore they will naturally end with a false conclusion. Day. News, July 14, 1962. It was at this time that Clare Booth Luce stated in the McCall's magazine that the Mormon Church teaches that the Negroes have inferior souls and a Mormon might have some difficulty in carrying the Negro vote in Michigan. The liberal element of the church was beginning to emerge and cast its vote for the Negro. In an interview with the New York Times, Hugh B. Brown explained their efforts to make the change in church doctrine. The top leadership of the Mormon Church is seriously considering the abandonment of its historic policy of discrimination against Negroes. One of the highest officers of the church said today that the possibility of removing this religious disability against Negroes has been under serious consideration. We are in the midst of a survey looking toward the possibility of admitting Negroes, said Hugh B. Brown, one of the two counselors serving President David O. McKay in the first presidency of the Mormon Church. Mr. Brown, a 79-year-old former attorney, said he believed that if the change were made, it would be a doctrinal revision for Mormonism of a magnitude matching the abandonment of polygamy in 1890. The whole problem of the Negro is being considered by the leaders of the church in the light of racial relationships everywhere, Mr. Brown said. We don't want to go too fast in this matter. We want to be fair. New York Times, Friday, June 7, 1963. Right bracket on October 5, 1963, an item appeared in the Deseret News, which stated that the NAACP would picket Temple Square on Saturday if the church did not present an acceptable statement on civil rights before that day. Mormon leaders apparently realized the bad publicity that would be aroused through this kind of demonstration, and on October 6, 1963, Hugh B. Brown made a statement regarding civil rights. During recent months, both in Salt Lake City and across the nation, considerable interest has been expressed on the matter of civil rights. We would like it to be known that there is in this church no doctrine, belief, or practice that is intended to deny the enjoyment of full civil rights by any person, regardless of race, color, or creed. We say again, as we have said many times before, that we believe that all men are the children of the same God, and that it is a moral evil for any person or group of persons to deny any human being the right to gainful employment, to full educational opportunity, and to every privilege of citizenship. Just as it is a moral evil to deny him the right to worship according to the dictates of his own conscience. We call upon all men, everywhere, both within and outside the church, to commit themselves to the establishment of full civil equality for all of God's children. Deseret News, October 6, 1963. This was an outstanding announcement which should have been defended and explained more fully. First, the church did not believe or practice any form of denial of civil rights to any people. Second, the church as well as anyone else should have the right to worship according to the dictates of their conscience. If the NAACP, the government or anyone else attempted to tell the Mormon church they had to bestow, restrict or prohibit the priesthood, then they were denying the church their right to worship. The church was in no way under an obligation to listen to civil clamor on how to practice their worship services. It was announced about this time that there would be a mission in Nigeria. It was on January the 11th, 1963, that the president of the church announced that a mission was going to be established in Nigeria. Missionaries were called and set apart for the mission, but nothing happened. For months the missionaries were waiting their call to leave, but still no word came. By August of that year, they had not left for that mission, and the church said things were still unsettled. It remained unsettled for years. Another liberal critic of the priesthood doctrine, Sterling M. McMurrin, said that time is running out on the Mormon Church to exert any influence or leadership on the greatest moral struggle of our time, civil rights. Chicago Sun-Times, April 5, 1965, McMurrin wrote, preached and lectured in his efforts to get the priesthood to the Negroes. He freely gave his opinions to President McKay and the church members, as well as to the NAACP and its members, regarding the priesthood's crude superstitions about Negroes and its social injustice. One of his lectures to the NAACP was sold for $1 donations to their funds. He, of course, won much favor with the NAACP by tickling their ears with such statements as, "Some Mormons go so far as to hold that the present and past social and economic predicament of the Negroes is a just reward or punishment for their pre-earth sins. It is difficult to understand how people who are otherwise typically intelligent and moral can believe and defend such crude immoral nonsense, but it is nothing new for religion to be a perpetrator of both nonsense and immorality." The Negroes among the Mormons, page 7. But Apostle Ezra T. Benson didn't share McMurrin's love for civil rights protesters, nor what they were attempting to accomplish in this country, for he states, "Before I left for Europe I warned how the communists were using the civil rights movement to promote revolution and eventual takeover of this right bracket country. When are we going to wake up? What do you know about the dangerous civil rights agitation in Mississippi? Do you fear the destruction of all vestiges of state government? Now, brethren, the Lord never promised there would not be traitors in the church. We have the ignorant, the sleepy and the deceived who provide temptations and avenues of apostasy for the unwary and the unfaithful." Salt Lake Tribune, April 7, 1965, PA 5. And previously, Apostle Benson was reported in the Deseret News as saying, Logan, Utah. Former Agriculture Secretary Ezra Taft Benson charged Friday night that the civil rights movement in the South had been fomented almost entirely by the communists. Elder Benson, a member of the Council of the 12 of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, said in a speech at a public meeting here that the whole civil rights movement was phony. The whole slogan of "civil rights is used to make trouble in the South today" is an exact parallel to the slogan of "agrarian reform" which they used in China, he added. The pending "civil rights legislation is, I am convinced, about 10% civil rights and 90% a further extension of socialistic federal controls," Elder Benson said. It is part of the pattern for the communist takeover of America. December 14, 1963. Benson was not wrong according to FBI reports, for they exposed the organizers, promoters and financiers of these groups, and left no doubts as to what their purpose was, and who their affiliates really were. In the spring of 1965 the Utah State Legislature had several civil rights bills before them, but the NAACP thought that church influence would defeat them, so they met with the first presidency. It was then agreed that an unsigned editorial would appear in the Deseret News supporting fair employment and housing. But no editorial appeared. When questioned about it, President Tanner replied, "We have decided to remain silent." So, the next day, the NAACP organized and led a prayer march from the federal office building to the steps of the church administration building. The Deseret News printed an article on its obituary page which stated, "About 250 persons demonstrated in front of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints offices Sunday, asking for a statement on civil rights." Mr. Driver said the NAACP is asking for a civil rights statement because the legislature has used the position of the church to stymie the Fair Employment Bill. Day. News, March 8, 1965. The NAACP decided to start an operation of boycotting the church, which appeared to be adopted for the specific purpose of retaliation. The proposed resolution was offered by the Salt Lake and Ogden branches of the NAACP. It also urged that embassies in South America, Asia and Africa refuse to grant visas to missionaries and representatives of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints until such time as the doctrine of non-white inferiority is changed and rescinded by that church, and a positive policy of support for civil rights is taken by the same church. Salt Lake Tribune, July 2, 1965. In 1963, a student in California from Nigeria wrote back home after hearing the doctrines of the Mormons. His letter was printed in a newspaper there, a portion of which said, "Their God is not our God. I do not believe in a God whose adherents preach the superiority of one race over the other. And this is what the Mormons preach." The big question is, why should the Mormons leave proselyting among the Negroes in America and decide to go to Nigeria? The Mormons could by trickery establish a church in Nigeria and use this as massive propaganda for propagating and spreading their religion of race hate and race superiority and discrimination in America. Ambrose Chukwu, the editor, wrote in the same paper, "Our correspondent has gone into great pains to expose this organization because he fears it may come to Nigeria thoroughly disguised. These so-called Latter-day Saints must be recognized for what they are, godless Harenvakism, and must not be allowed into this country. Since the United States government preaches the equality of all races, Mr. Kennedy must ban this anti-Negro organization that preaches heretic doctrines." The Nigerian Outlook, March 5, 1963, in Yugu, Nigeria. The Nigerians arose to that appeal and were successful in keeping the missionaries out of Nigeria, even though much of the Mormon literature had already been received and read by many of the black people in Nigeria. Many of them organized their own branches. Time magazine reported, "Pending a new revelation, possibly at any time, Mormons are committed to a certain degree of built-in segregation. Negroes cannot be admitted to the church's priesthood. For this reason, Mormon missionaries have never tried very hard to make converts in black Africa. Yet Mormons also believe that Negroes may be admitted to the priesthood in heaven. This apparently is good enough for 7,000 Ibibio, Ibo and Efik tribesmen in eastern Nigeria, who have gone ahead to organize their own branch of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints." Fascinated by the dramatic life of the Mormon prophet, Anaidi Obert of Io decided to form a branch of the church in Nigeria, and wrote for more information to Mormon headquarters in Salt Lake City. Mormon leaders sent back books explaining the laws and doctrines, and in 1959 dispatched to Africa Elder Lamar Williams, who was much impressed by the Nigerians' zeal and orthodoxy. Since then, the Nigerian Saints, governed by Obert and a council of 75 elders, have established branches in 6 cities. Church chiefs are somewhat at a loss on how to deal with their new African converts, especially since the Nigerian government will not give resident visas to any missionaries from the U.S. This is quite a unique situation, admits Hugh B. Brown, Mormon First Counselor. One problem now is that in the absence of supervision from Utah, the Nigerian Saints appear to be deviating somewhat from strict adherence to Revelation. Some Nigerian Mormons practice polygamy forbidden in the U.S. Church since 1890, and the converts already seem to have established their own black hierarchy, priests and all. "I don't have to wait for Revelation to know that I am the natural head in Nigeria," snaps Obert, who is accepted by his elders as their bishop. Time magazine, June 18, 1965, page 56. Among the church's problems in the Nigerian Latter-day Saint branches were the lack of control over their organization and operation, no governing by the priesthood, and inability to collect their tithing. But the seriousness of the situation extended beyond their functional limitations. Hugh B. Brown wrote a letter on February 10, 1966, in which he stated, "We are just now wrestling with the problems in Nigeria, where some 5,000 people have applied for baptism into the church, but where the government officials are opposing us, and where, if we should baptize them, we would involve ourselves in financial problems which could very well bankrupt the church." Not just the LDS Church, but also the United States in general was experiencing great difficulties from this Negro problem. A rash of rioting, burning, and killing swept across America. Willful and malicious destruction moved from state to state, initiated right bracket by Negroes in a wave of protest. Civil rights had become civil riots. Watts, Detroit, Chicago, Washington, D.C., and many other cities suffered destruction amounting to billions of dollars. This action soon brought a new wave of compromises and appeasements from the government by way of increased civil rights bills in Congress. After that, the American Negro began to turn their attentions and attacks upon the Mormon Church, since they were one of the last strongholds against racism. On April 14, 1968, the news broke a boycott was being placed against the Brigham Young University. A Mormon church leader said Saturday that a boycott by 8 Negroes of a Brigham Young University track and field meet is the action by some extremists who have gotten the wrong idea of what the church position is. The University of Texas El Paso athletes stayed away from Saturday's competition at the church-operated BYU in Provo, Utah. They said there was a belief on the campus that the blacks are inferior and that we are disciples of the devil. *****. President Hugh B. Brown, a member of the First Presidency of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Mormon, said the athletes apparently are unclear on the church's doctrine denying Negroes membership in the Mormon priesthood. At the present time, we do not give Negroes the priesthood. Priesthood, in our view, is leadership. There is not enough leadership among Negroes to warrant establishing him as a member of leadership, President Brown said. Arizona Daily Star, April 14, 1968. Thus, the church Negro problem grew into the national limelight and even became a political football when Mormon George Romney entered the candidacy for president. Life magazine wrote, "It would require a revelation through the present prophet, David Zero. McKay, to open the priesthood to the few Negro Mormons who presently exist, and First Counselor Brown warns, I think it would be detrimental to him for the church to come out with the revelation right now. It would have a reverse effect, i.e., that of appearing to revise God's word to assist a possible candidacy." Life, May 5, 1967. Other questions arose concerning George Romney's candidacy, such as those reported by the SL Tribune. In the question-answer period after George Romney's speech, a stout, middle-aged Negro woman came to the platform and identified herself as Dr. Anna Grant, a professor of sociology. She explained that she had studied Romney's Mormon faith, and that she had reasons to believe that Mormons are taught the kind of anthropological untruths that would make them believe Negroes are inferior. "I know you cannot change Mormonism, but I just wonder how you can be as comfortable in your beliefs as you indicated. I appreciate this question being asked," Romney said, "because I know from your reaction that it's a question you're interested in." The audience laughed, softly and nervously. "It is not true," Romney told them, "that my faith preaches a racist doctrine. Now it is true that a Negro cannot hold the priesthood in my church." Romney paused to bring his fist crashing down on the podium. "I have been raised from childhood with the firm belief that the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States are divinely inspired documents, and as a result of my background, I have fought in my private life to eliminate social injustice and racial discrimination." Salt Lake Tribune, May 4, 1967. The Mormon Church was becoming notably famous for its position on the Negro issue more than for any other doctrine, and the increasing heat of racial pressures in the country has brought the church into focus as one of the few uncracked fortresses of discrimination. Los Angeles Times, August 27, 1967. A few Mormons themselves were aggravated at the church's stand regarding Negroes because their political image was being marred. Interior Secretary Stuart Udall wrote, "It was inevitable that national attention would be focused on what critics have called the anti-Negro doctrine of the LDS Church. As the church becomes increasingly an object of national interest, this attention is certain to intensify, for the divine curse concept, which is so commonly held among our people, runs counter to the great stream of modern religious and social thought. We Mormons cannot escape persistent, painful inquiries into the sources and grounds of this belief. Nor can we exculpate ourselves and our church from justified condemnation by the rationalization that we support the Constitution, believe that all men are brothers, and favor equal rights for all citizens. This issue must be resolved. It must be resolved because we are wrong, and it is past the time when we should have seen the right." Dialogue. A Journal of Mormon Thought, Autumn 1967, page 8. However, while some liberals within the church were trying to abolish the Negro doctrine, others were valiantly defending it. When Udall spoke against the doctrine, Paul C. Richards responded by saying, "The church is either true or it isn't. If it changes its stand on the strength of the great stream of modern religious and social thought, it will be proven untrue. If that happens, the more serious members would do well to join the Cub Scouts. It's cheaper and there is less work and less criticism. If the church is true, it will hold to its beliefs in spite of its members." Dialogue. A Journal of Mormon Thought, Autumn 1967, page 6. Right bracket. But the sports arena was still the most popular and heated battlefield for the church's unpopular doctrine. San Jose, California. Classes for San Jose State College's 24,000 students returned to normal Wednesday after a day of violence. Classroom invasions, beatings, vandalism and small trash fires were used Tuesday in an attempt to enforce a strike, such as the one which has closed San Francisco State College. The United Black Students for Action had called the strike to enforce demands for cancellation of Saturday's football game with Brigham Young University. San Jose, California. San Jose State's black athletes voted Monday to turn in their scholarships because of the revocation of scholarships of 7 football players who did not play in Saturday's game against Brigham Young University. The football players protested what they called the racist philosophy of BYU. Salt Lake Tribune, December 3, 1968. Arizona ball teams also took up the chant against the church through the sports medium. Tucson, Arizona. The Student Senate at the University of Arizona had asked both the school and the Western Athletic Conference to break ties with Brigham Young University. By a vote of 18-5-1, the Student Senate passed the resolution condemning racial discrimination at BYU. Salt Lake Tribune, October 25, 1969. Phoenix, Arizona. Several Western Athletic Conference athletic directors Tuesday warned of a possible breakup of the conference because of racial policies at Brigham Young University. Salt Lake Tribune, October 29, 1969. Right bracket. Then came an announcement in California that created the greatest athletic setback for BYU. Stanford, California. Stanford University announced Wednesday it will schedule no new athletic or other competitions with Brigham Young University because of alleged racial discrimination by the Mormon Church. Salt Lake Tribune, November 13, 1969. When Stanford, a member of the Pacific 8 Conference, severed all relations with BYU, it was one of the greatest blows to the church. Other organizations and churches took up the protest. The Church of the Black Cross, a new denomination seeking to improve black people's position in society, both through religion and active community work, was calling for boycott of Mormon goods, such as record albums of the Mormon Tabernacle Choir. Discouraging tourist travel to Utah, home state of the church. Taxpayer petitions to the government asking that the Mormon Church's tax-exempt status be abolished. Denver Post, November 15, 1969. By now Arizona had organized more effective means of boycotting the church. The Salt Lake Tribune reported that when BYU ballplayers landed in Phoenix, someone muttered that a protest march would be held before the football game that night. That evening 250 Arizona State University students, most of them black, marched militantly under torchlight, wearing black armbands and carrying placards protesting the allegedly racist policies at BYU. The group's leader, John Mask, led the demonstrators in an evening-long chant, "Down with BYU," and "Get rid of the racists." Salt Lake Tribune, November 30, 1969. Ernest L. Wilkinson, president of Brigham Young University at this time, was of course upset over the right bracket actions of these universities, and he commented, "During the past year or two, Brigham Young University has received national attention because of protests and boycotts involving our athletic teams." Daily Universe BYU, December 15, 1969. It was about this time, when greater pressure was being applied, that more promises of a change in the Negro doctrine would eventually come forth. Dr. Ernest L. Wilkinson, president of BYU, charged this week that Stanford was therefore guilty of religious discrimination on hearsay evidence. But Press. Brown disclosed Wednesday that Willard Wyman, assistant to Stanford's president Kenneth Pitzer, had contacted him 1 week prior to the severance of relations with BYU, and that he had verified the racial doctrine. Press. Brown also disclosed that he had told Wyman that the church is not prejudiced in any way but this one, but I think that will change. Salt Lake Tribune, December 25, 1969. And from the same newspaper, another news item on the change of that doctrine appeared. San Francisco. The Mormon Church's denial of its priesthood to Negroes of African lineage will change in the not-too-far-distant future, according to Hugh B. Brown, one of the highest-ranking officials of The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. SL Tribune, December 25, 1969. The civil rights and the religious rights were finally focused into a statement signed by Hugh B. Brown and N. Eldon Tanner, and was sent to general authorities, regional representatives of the 12, stake presidents, mission presidents, and bishops. In view of confusion that has arisen, it was decided at a meeting of the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12 to restate the position of the Church with regard to the Negro, both in society and in the Church we believe the Negro, as well as those of other races, should have his full constitutional privileges. Each citizen must have equal opportunities and protection under the law, with reference to civil rights. However, matters of faith, conscience, and theology are not within the purview of the civil law. The First Amendment to the Constitution specifically provides that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. *****. But we believe that this work is directed by God, and that the conferring of the priesthood must await His revelation. To do otherwise would be to deny the very premise on which the Church is established. The question of bestowing or withholding priesthood in the Church is a matter of religion, and not a matter of constitutional right. December 15, 1969, reprinted in the Church News, Jan. 10, 1970. But protests against the Church for their Negro doctrine continued all over the western states. Tucson, Arizona. Some 3,000 University of Arizona students participated Wednesday in a 2-hour rally, demanding that the school sever relations with fellow Western Athletic Conference member, Brigham Young University. Day. News, January 15, 1970. Ending a 10-game ordeal on the road, the Cougars last week limped home to Provo, Utah, with a 4-10 record, one of the worst starts in Stan Watt's lengthy coaching career. That was depressing enough, of course, but the boys from the Y were bedeviled by a special problem. A gathering wave of protest against a recently reaffirmed doctrine of the Mormon Church, that Negroes be denied admission to priesthood. As much as the Cougars would like to ignore them, the protests have grown in intensity to the point where they have almost transcended all else. Sports Illustrated, January 26, 1970, page 38. Seattle. A garbage-throwing demonstration by about 20 blacks, protesting what one of them said was racism practiced by Brigham Young University, delayed the start of a gymnastics meet between Washington and BYU his Saturday afternoon. The blacks walked onto a mat just before the first event and broke eggs and poured oil, catsup and salad dressing onto the mat, officials said. After tipping over chalk trays, throwing chairs onto the mat and throwing a pail of water into Hugh's face, the demonstrators departed. SL Tribune, February 1, 1970. The doctrine of actual discrimination was established when the Church and the Boy Scouts were brought into a confrontation with the law. This gained more national publicity for the Church in 1974, and the NAACP pushed for a lawsuit. A 12-year-old Boy Scout has been denied a senior patrol leadership in his troop because he is black, Don L. Cope, black ombudsman for the state, said Wednesday. The ombudsman said Mormon troop policy is that in order for a scout to become a patrol leader, he must be a deacon's quorum president in the LDS Church. Since the boy cannot hold the priesthood, he cannot become a patrol leader. SL Tribune, July 18, 1974. The Church backed down on their position in this matter, and made a public statement, and aptly so, since it was a civil matter. Shortly before Boy Scout officials were to appear in federal court Friday morning on charges of discrimination, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints issued a policy change which will allow black youths to be senior patrol leaders, a position formerly reserved for white LDS youths in troops sponsored by the Church. An LDS Church spokesman said Friday under the guidelines set forth in the statement, a young man other than president of the Deacons Quorum right bracket could become the senior patrol leader if he is better qualified. SL Tribune, August 3, 1974. The national news media was pressuring the Church from without, and liberal Mormons were pushing from within. Bruce R. McConkie was trying to quell the liberals by saying, Am I valiant if I am deeply concerned about the Church's stand on who can or who cannot receive the priesthood and think it is time for a new revelation on this doctrine? Am I valiant if I engage in gambling, play cards, go to pornographic movies? Bruce R. McConkie, Ensign, November 1974, page 35. Within the Church, the breach between strong doctrinarians and the liberal protesters reached its climax when one of the members decided to ordain a Negro himself. Portland, or a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, ordained a black into the priesthood Friday, saying he did so in an attempt to force a revision in Mormon doctrine about the Negro race. Douglas A. Wallace first baptized Larry Lester in the swimming pool of a motel in northeast Portland. He then ordained Lester to the office of priest in the Aaronic priesthood of the LDS Church. The rites were preceded by a news conference at which Wallace said he has long been bothered by the Mormon Church's bias against blacks, and he feels the time has come to challenge it. Wallace said he hopes there are no recriminations against him for his action, such as excommunication. SL Tribune, April 3, 1976. This incident again created a stir in the national news media and opened the sore for the public eye. Church excommunicated Wallace for insubordination to the rules and policy of the Church, but Wallace refused to stop his protest. He appeared at conference in the right bracket spring of 1976, and after a confrontation with church personnel, Mr. Wallace was ejected from the tabernacle. Later he was served with a court order barring him from attending conference. SL Tribune, October 4, 1976. The police were then involved in keeping him off Temple Square. However, the surveillance of Wallace extended beyond the bounds of Temple Square, as an unfortunate incident soon proved. At the April conference of 1977, the tragic shooting of a police officer, which permanently paralyzed him, made the headlines. Then Wallace made a charge. Mormon dissident Douglas A. Wallace charged Monday that a Salt Lake City police officer, shot early Sunday, was keeping surveillance on him in a nearby residence. Acting Police Chief Edgar A. Bryan Jr. denied it. He said his men were not keeping surveillance on Mr. Wallace, an excommunicated member of the Church, but he would not say what the stakeout's purpose was. Officer David W. Olson remained in critical condition Monday at St. Mark's Hospital, where personnel said he suffered a severed spinal cord from a single shot in the neck. The policeman was shot accidentally by his partner. SL Tribune, April 5, 1977. Wallace and his attorneys were busy trying to uncover the facts in the incident, so they decided to bring lawsuits against the police department. Ex-Mormon Douglas Wallace, who claims the wounding of an undercover police officer was done while police held surveillance on him, Tuesday afternoon said he will subpoena various high-ranking police and sheriff's deputies to establish the fact. Mr. Wallace said also, "It is clear from the evidence that we have uncovered that I was under surveillance. The police department's denial of right bracket that simply compounds the wrong." SL Tribune, April 6, 1977. With such bad publicity and lawsuits on their heads, the police were finally forced to admit the truth of the surveillance. Salt Lake City police officers admitted Thursday that the accidental wounding of an undercover officer occurred during surveillance of Mormon dissident Douglas A. Wallace. Reports released Thursday by both the county sheriff's office and the county attorney show that 6 officers were on stakeout around the John W. Fitzgerald home where Mr. Wallace was staying. The lawmen were paired up in 3 police vehicles, and 2 of those were parked close together in opposite directions. SL Tribune, April 8, 1977. When Wallace discovered that he was the object of the surveillance, he reasoned that it was the Church that was responsible. Ex-Mormon Douglas Wallace Friday renewed his assertion that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was behind April police surveillance of Mr. Wallace that led to the accidental shooting of a Salt Lake City police officer. SL Tribune, September 17, 1977. The Church responded with a negative reply in the Deseret News, which then became a matter of objection to the wounded officer, David Olson, who wrote to the Tribune. "I would also like to thank Spencer W. Kimball for his incorrect press release concerning the police involvement, combined with the LDS Church's efforts to restrict Douglas A. Wallace from the temple grounds, specifically the tabernacle, on April 3, 1977. His denial of these actions is wrong. Any man who can take such actions and still call himself a prophet deserves more than I to be confined to this wheelchair." SL Tribune, January 18, 1978. This whole affair became a national embarrassment to Kimball and the church. However, Wallace wasn't the only troublemaker. Byron Marchant had begun in the fall of 1977 to add his objections to the church's Negro policy. Salt Lake City. The man who cast the first vote in modern history against a leader of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has been excommunicated and fired as chapel janitor. Byron Marchant, 35, of Salt Lake, is the second opponent of the church policy withholding the priesthood from blacks to be excommunicated in the last 2 years. Dallas Morning News, October 20, 1977. Byron began a massive attack on church doctrine by printing brochures which appealed for a public demonstration. His pamphlet read, "Next October Conference, 1978, I will join all interested in a march on Temple Square in Salt Lake City. In the event the Mormon Church decides to ordain worthy Afro-Americans to the priesthood, this demonstration will be a sort of celebration, a demonstration of support. In the meantime, every person and/or group concerned about Utah racism is encouraged to speak out and attend the October protest." Marchant never had a chance to complete his demonstration program because in June the church made the announcement which reversed their Negro policy. One of the most serious problems arising from the Negro blood situation came from Brazil. The Deseret News mentioned this fact by saying, "A major problem the church has faced with its policy regarding blacks was in Brazil, where the right bracket church is building a temple. Many people there are mixed racially, and it is often impossible to determine whether church members have black ancestry." Deseret News, June 10, 1978. Church leaders had been faced with this problem in Brazil for many years, and it continued to grow. Lester E. Bush Jr. had written, "The growth of the international church was clearly bringing new problems. Brazil was particularly difficult." Later that year, J. Reuben Clark, first counselor to George Albert Smith, reported that the church was entering into a situation in doing missionary work where it is very difficult if not impossible to tell who has Negro blood and who has not. He said that if we are baptizing Brazilians, we are almost certainly baptizing people of Negro blood, and that if the priesthood is conferred upon them, which no doubt it is, we are facing a very serious problem. Dialogue, Spring 1973, page 41. In a letter by Gary Lobb, published in Dialogue, he explained the seriousness and the consequences of that problem in Brazil, as a result of his own personal observations. "My studies currently in Brazil have led me to conclude that most Brazilians who are not second or third generation descendants of German, Italian, Polish, or Japanese immigrants are probably descendants of Negroes. This is especially true among the lower and lower middle classes, which make up a large portion of LDS church membership in this land. In some of the branches of the church which my wife and I have attended here in Brazil, there appear to be priesthood bearers who possess the essential characteristics of the Negroid races." Dialogue, Autumn 1968, page 8. Missionary work had been pushed very extensively in Brazil, and with that push, the church decided to build a temple there. But the problem would only be right bracket intensified. Those who would be converted to the church in Brazil would naturally want to go through the temple, and those who contributed money or labor on the temple would want to go through it. But the question arises, if so many people in Brazil are of mixed blood, why should a temple be built there at all? Why should they build the church's largest temple in Washington, D.C., where nearly 80% of the people there are of Negro origin? These two temples would be the final factor influencing the reversal of the church stand on the Negro. In summary then, the withholding of priesthood from the Negro had created a sea of dissent and dissatisfaction. Missionary work was being affected, BYU sports activities were curtailed, the favorable image of the church was eroding in the eyes of the nation. Many members were also launching their dissatisfaction to the waves of protest. From within and without, the church was being attacked by forces not dissimilar to those during the era of 1890. Uncomfortable questions, embarrassing news coverages, and a multitude of lawsuits were bringing the church authorities to their knees. Amidst this violent storm of adversity, the president of the church was seeking for a means of relief, some way to resolve the problems that were deluging upon him and the church. Would he find an answer to the problem of this priesthood doctrine? Would it be a medicine to appease the throes of the Gentiles, or a plague upon priesthood of Israel? Would he resolve the issue with an orchid or an onion? Would his answer become a blessing or a curse?